All right. Hi, everyone. We are diving into First Corinthians 11 this week, and this one is, I think, the hardest chapter to understand in First Corinthians. So, because of that, I've given you a longer Bible study. It's not like more questions, really, it's just more help. And you'll see what I mean once we start diving in. Basically, what you need to know is that Paul's been making a theological point up to this point, and in chapters 11 to 14, he's going to start to apply it. But here's the problem, and this is my little graphic that I've given you on page 1. We cannot take a first century application and necessarily directly apply it in 2019. Okay. What I mean is that, so in this chapter, we're going to see these directions about head coverings for women or their hair length or just the way they present themselves. And what has historically been, well, not always, but sometimes what happens is we read that and we say, okay, Paul says women shouldn't cover their heads in church. Um, or I'm sorry, women should cover their heads in church. I always get this mixed up. And we say, okay, well, that's what we're going to do now. Or like it says, guys shouldn't cover their heads in church. So that means don't wear hats to church. The Bible says so. Okay, that doesn't always work because what we end up doing is we end up picking what feels feasible to us. Um, what we need to do instead is we need to figure out why Paul is giving this application. Now, we already have a hint because we've been studying First Corinthians. It has something to do with caring for the good of the other person. That's what Paul's been saying. Whether you drink or whatever, eat or whatever you do it for the glory of God. And that's in the context of don't seek your own good, seek the good of your neighbor. So these things are going to have something to do. This application that Paul is going to give has something to do with that point. What we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out the principle that's at play. Once you figure out that principle that's always true across time, then we can apply it in the 21st century. Okay. If you skip that step, you're going to misapply probably. There's two issues here. The first is with head coverings, and the second is with the Lord's Supper. Both have a similar point. They're very different passages, but I hope we can wrap it together nicely at the end. So that's all of page 1 of what I just said. That's just background information talking about how to apply. So use that little graphic as you will, and that's kind of like an FYI for you, and just for to share with your folks about what you're about to do together. So I encourage at least reading them that little paragraph where I have the bold part about what principle is causing Paul to say these things. That's just teaching you teach others to interpret correctly. Okay, so page 2 and a little bit past it is where we really get started. And this is what I've done is I've given you some instruction. First is to read 2 to 16, verses 2 to 16. Just read it together. And it's tough, guys. I mean, this passage says some things that you're not going to feel comfortable with right away. Acknowledge that. Feel free to share with your group, give them warning, be like, hey, this is going to be tough. It's going to say some tough things, but we're going to make sense of it together. And so then what I've given you is some notes. It's kind of a mini little commentary. What I want to do is walk through that right now because I couldn't write everything I wanted to say. And hopefully this will help understand. So what Paul is basically saying in this chapter is he is encouraging women, specifically women, although he talks about men as well, to dress differently or concerning how they are either wearing their hair or whether or not they're covering their head. That's the basic issue. So he starts in verse 3 by saying, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. That verse is a bombshell right away. But what he's doing is Paul is starting with an argument about spiritual authority. So think of Ephesians 5 when Paul says that the husband is the head of the wife. Now, a quick note that I don't have in here is that some versions might say man and woman. My preference is to think that it's talking about husbands and wives because of what he's going to say. I think it'll make sense why. But basically, Paul's going to start with saying there is a created spiritual authority. And when you're married, Ephesians 5 in no uncertain terms talks about how It says it's that famous passage, wives submit to your husbands. But what we need to remember is that biblical spiritual authority is not oppressive. Okay. Spiritual authority has to do with self sacrifice. So when the Bible asks women in Ephesians to submit to men, to their husbands, he, he is also saying, men, do what I did and lay down your life for your wife. That's so when you come under spiritual authority, you come under a spiritual authority of grace and self-sacrifice. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to know. Now, this passage is going to talk more to women than it is to men, but that is not because, like I say in my note here, that women have more restrictions or be overly submissive. The problem is the reason that Paul addresses women more specifically in this passage is simply that the problem in the Corinthian church had to do with women. The men in this instance were not really the problem. Obviously, that could have gone either way. So don't just understand that going in. Okay. So now the two issues that are coming up have to do with hair length and head covering, and I have the cultural implications for both of them there. Basically, the way that you wore your hair in that culture um, had something to do with your sexuality. That is not necessarily true in most places in the United States. Maybe in years ago, if guys wore their hair long or if girls wore their hair short, it had something to do with suggesting homosexuality, and that's just not the case really anymore. Maybe where some of you are from, that's more people kind of think more that way, but typically uh, that's not the way it is. Like the way we dress and the way that we wear our hair or things like that, they are a little more. They have a little less to do with our sexuality um, than it did during this time. Also, covering of head had something to do with worship in pagan circles. Worshiping idols had to do with covering or not covering your head. And so when the women were not covering their heads, um, they were doing two things. So again, speaking, I think specifically speaking to married women, although this principle applies to the unmarried as well. You're invited by uncovering their head. The married woman was saying basically, it was an invitation of singleness. And this is a little confusing because it's based on how the worship went. The worship of idols had to do with sex and sexuality and things like that. And so an uncovered head had said something to do about inviting suitors and luring men with sexuality. So this certainly applies to single women as well. But in this passage, the married men were being shamed by this. The women were uncovering their heads, and that was shameful to their husbands because in that culture, people would see the woman with her head uncovered, and um, they would think that woman is single. It was like promiscuous in a way. So we can understand the principle there, especially for married women. The principle is not shaming their husband, again, thinking of the good of others, but it applies to single women as well. We'll get to that in our application. Okay, so that's what the issue is. We have to read everything in this passage through that lens to understand what Paul is saying. So in verse 7, what he does is he goes back and he argues his point from a perspective of creation. And basically what he's saying is, especially in verse 7 to 9 especially, he's saying man was created first, just in the created order. Woman was created second. And there is something to do with spiritual authority in that relationship right off the bat. And again, that's not an oppressive authority or like I rule over you. Uh, it's something else. It's a different kind of leadership. The way that Christ leads us graciously and lovingly. I hope that makes sense. But he's arguing from this order. So it's kind of like, look, this is set up here. And so how much more should these women not disgrace their husbands because of the way God has created things? How much more should women not disgrace their husbands? And so, verse 10, he's basically saying, so you need to have control over what you do on your head. You need to think about what you're doing and how that affects yourself and others and your husbands and the men around you. The um, uh, how the church and the men are viewed and things like that. Now, in verse 11, he wants to be clear, it seems, that he's not trying to diminish women or to say that men and women are not equal, right? So he's not saying that men are created first, women are created second, therefore men greater than women in some way. Not so. He's not saying that. He's simply insisting that there are two complementary genders, and complementary means that each has a role and relationship to the other. And what women were doing was subverting that relationship by the way they were acting. Okay. Maintaining that differentiation honors both God and the husband. Okay. Whew, there's a lot here. Okay, so in verses 13 to 16, he asks some further questions and he kind of prompts the women and the men a little bit to behave differently. And Paul's general point is that men and women should consider cultural norms when deciding how to look and dress. And so then I have some more general principles there, which you can read, and I think I've already talked about them. One thing I haven't talked about is the third bullet point there. There's an implicit argument for God-given gender and sexuality, and to behave in ways that suggest homosexuality or identification with a different gender is not God-honoring or honoring to people of the opposite gender. Now, that statement is like a firecracker, okay? But we need to think about that, not just to say like, we need to think about that within our culture. That's what all this has to do. So it's not just like, I'm not just saying that, flippantly. We need to think about what that means in our culture. And I hope that the questions will do that for you. So in the first question, I have you thinking about what does it maybe look like to send a sexually promiscuous message? Okay. So this impacts our standards of modesty and how we behave towards opposite gender. And then positively, what does it look like to behave in a way that honors the opposite sex? Okay, we have to think about that. The next question I have you thinking about is acting or dressing in ways that sends confusing messages about your religious affiliation. So we need to think about what it looks like to become all things, all people, or a Jew to the Jews, to people in different religions without losing our distinctiveness as Christians. To what extent do we participate and act and behave and dress like people from other religions? So a good example might be if there's a Christian, try not to be ignorant here. If there's a Christian in like the Middle East, should the woman wear? If you're a woman in the Middle East, should you wear a head covering? To what extent does that identify you with being Muslim? That's a very sensitive and very complicated issue. What I just said. So we need to think about what are the lines? How do we maintain our distinctiveness with also becoming all things to all people? And finally, just broadly, what is the Christian relationship with social convention of how to dress and act? How do we walk the line of being distinctive and yet not sending unnecessarily confusing messages? So in all this, I'm just asking you to take this back out, think about the principle, what's our relationship? That could probably take you the whole hour, but hopefully you can move through it and kind of focus people and not get lost in some of the weeds of that part of the chapter. But okay, the next part is the Lord's Supper. This is a lot. The next part of the Lord's Supper. And what's happening here is that Paul is addressing this issue of the poor and wealthy and how they're interacting in the Lord's Supper. So what's happening is that the wealthy believers are the ones that were hosting the Lord's Supper because they had the space to do it. It was a meal in their times, not like what we do now. And so the wealthy Christians could come early and participate. The poor could not. They had generally to work on Saturday, and they would come later. And because the wealthy Christians had a little more freedom by the nature of their wealth, they would fill up the kind of primary room where the Lord's Supper was happening, and they would eat a lot of the food and get drunk, which is just a problem in and of itself. And the poorer Christians, the poorer Christians would come later, and they would be kind of left to themselves in another room with less food, somehow less than. And Paul was really upset about this. He's saying that's not the Lord's Supper. That's something else. That's your own supper. And so first, let's think about this. How do we see this division of poor and wealthy in our church, and what does that look like? So that's something to think about. That's not the overall purpose of the passage. it's good to think about, but I do think it's helpful to take a minute to land there. So then what he does, Paul, after kind of painting the issue in verses 23 to 26, he goes back and does that kind of classic institution of the Lord's Supper. You kind of hear this read in churches sometimes. And so we are supposed to remember when we partake of what God has done for us, right? So the question is, why is that incongruent with acting the way that the Corinthians were acting? And the answer is, if you are sitting there and you're thinking, you're reflecting on God's graciousness towards you, and you are not living out gracious self-sacrifice, thinking of others like Christ was doing for us, you've missed it. You've missed the point. And because of that, the Lord's Supper is not just about you. This is, I think, a big mistake that we make. In addition to remembering the Lord's self-gracious, sacrificial gracious to us, what's another purpose? It's demonstrating God's love by the way that we treat one another and share with each other. We need to remember that the Lord's Supper and just the way that we live in church is not about us. It's about loving others the way that Christ has loved us. We show Christ to people when we do that. And when we become people where church is all about us, or the Lord's Supper is all about us, or the sermon's all about us, that's not wrong, but we've missed part of it. It's about others. Remember, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor. The law and the prophets hang on all of that. The Bible hangs on all of that. So, and then we have the passage at the end. You've heard people say, examine yourself, don't eat and drink in an unworthy manner. What does that mean? Well, it could mean a couple things. It could mean you're not worthy of what Christ has done, or you're not discerning other people. And in my mind, they're the same thing. If you are remembering the body of Christ with a self-sacrificial love towards us, that should draw you out to love others. So what does it mean in verse 29 to eat and drink without discerning the body? Is the body Christ's body or the body of Christ? Both, right? It's both things. I also have you reading some verses about in Matthew and John, 1 John, about loving one another and how we can't say we love God if we don't love one another. 1 John is particularly strong with that. And it actually identifies, so like the way we treat others, and in Matthew especially, Matthew or Jesus identifies how we treat others with the way we treat him. And so it's some pretty strong language there. And it's the way we treat others is an indicator of our love for God, because once we start to grasp God's graciousness on us, it humbles us. It lowers us a few pegs. It helps us to have compassion and see others. If we don't get that, we don't get it. To put it, as maybe a strong way of putting it, but I think it's congruent with the biblical way of putting it. So finally, that hopefully that verse challenges you personally in some way. I encourage you to share that and then ask others if it's challenged them in some way. And then this week, I hope you can encourage your folks to find a way to love or serve someone else, whether that be practical or tangible, or intangible. Because really, that's what this chapter is about again. You're saying, my life is not about me. Sure, I'm me and I'm important because I'm a child of God, but often we get too stuck on me. And we need to remember that Jesus wasn't about me. He wasn't about himself. He was others focused. And this is an example of what it looks like when we lose sight of that within church life. So hopefully that will challenge you. Last week's challenge was to how we can be more geared towards others and helping them come to know Christ. This week it's a similar challenge, but I'm asking you to think of just some way just to show someone you love them. Maybe even try to do that in secret. It's kind of a powerful thing to do. So, okay, this is a longer video because the passage is so hard. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk. So have a good weekend. Bye.